Some of you may have heard me as worship began. I noted that today we are so fortunate to have Dr. Forbes with us in worship. This month marks the 10th anniversary of his retirement, and isn't it good to hear that voice? Happy Father's Day, Dr. Forbes, Reverend Livingston, and all of you who are celebrating today. Some of you may recall back in 2015 when the New York Times ran the obituary of Adele Morales. Morales was a gifted painter and artist who during her lifetime enjoyed a distinguished career in the arts. She was also the mother of 2 daughters and 2 granddaughters, and she lived to be 90 years old. The first line in her obituary read, Morales made headlines in 1960 when her husband, novelist Norman Mailer, stabbed and seriously wounded her at a drunken party. The front page headline of her obituary was, Wife Mailer stabbed, dies at 90. You would have thought the Times would have learned its lesson 2 years before, in 2013, when the paper printed an obituary of Yvonne Brill, which opened with the sentence, she made a mean beef stroganoff, followed her husband from job to job, took 8 years off to raise 3 children. She was the world's best mom. And the next paragraph read, Brill, who died Wednesday at 88 in Princeton, New Jersey, was also a brilliant rocket scientist who in the early 1970s invented a propulsion system to keep communication satellites from slipping out of their orbits. The Times isn't the only paper printing obituaries of this sort. In 2015, when Australian Colleen McCullough died, the obituary of this author of 25 novels, including The Thornbirds, which sold over 30 million copies, read, plain of feature and certainly overweight, she was nevertheless a woman of wit and warmth. Okay, so that's funny and also not funny. In response to these obituaries and others, the Washington Post ran a satirical piece called Obituaries for Men, imagining how obituaries might sound if men were written about in the same way that women were. Something perhaps like this. Teddy Roosevelt, resembling a fat walrus in little spectacles, he was nevertheless the president at one point or another. Even in this enlightened day and age, obituaries of women praise them for their best casserole, define them by their relationships to men, and remember them for how much they weighed. Never mind her brilliant artistry, or her international best-selling novel, or the fact that she was quite literally a rocket scientist. And I imagine that none of this is revelatory to all of you. You watched the news this week just like I did. And while we often speak in worship about the many expressions of systemic injustice, I realized it's rare to hear a sermon that speaks to the unique issues of misogyny and its problematic theological expression. And I'm not unaware that it might be a little challenging to hear a sermon like that today from a woman. But our allowance of injustice, the way that we limit voices and the freedom of certain groups of people in our society speaks to the way we value them. Because the identity and value of a person is inextricably tied to how we tell the story of their lives. And this is directly related to our relationships to God and to each other, because every week you and I gather here to tell and retell the stories of our faith. How do we tell those stories? What does the way we tell the story say about how we understand God and how we value each other? And if the way we treat each other, both within these walls and outside these walls does not reflect God's value of each one of us, a precious child of God, then we are telling the story the wrong way. Today, our text is calling us to think about how we tell the story of our life together, to consider who gets to tell the story and who doesn't, and today, to think a little bit more than usual about the women. Telling the story of faith from the perspective of women is so powerful. Why? Because it's an example of how we can begin to change perceptions, how we can start to use language to create an image of the world that God hopes for us, and how things can shift when we tell the stories of our faith with the voice and perspective of those who do not have privilege and power in our society. I can just imagine my obituary now. In 2017, on Father's Day no less, she entered the Riverside pulpit and commenced a feminist rant that made everyone uncomfortable. That day, she was having a fairly good hair day and was sporting a cheery, if risque, nail color. As we heard last week, today begins many weeks of ordinary time that stretch throughout the summer when our lectionary passages, the assigned passages for every week from the Revised Common Lectionary, take us deep into the well-known and well-loved stories of our faith. Stories that tell us about those who have lived before the struggle that we are engaged in now, trying to be the people of God in the world. The cultures and times of these stories are so different from our own, but the nature of humanity and the person of God remain the same. Today we begin our series of ordinary time passages with the story of Abraham and Sarah and the unexpected news that a child would be added to their family long after hopes of such a gift had died. Now I know you've probably heard this story before, and when you have, it has probably gone something like this. There was this man who desperately wanted a child. His wife failed her because she couldn't get pregnant. So God intervened and promised a child, but upon hearing the news that she would get pregnant, the 90-year-old woman laughed disrespectfully in a somewhat hysterical manner. Maybe today we can tell the story a bit differently. If we look again, conscious of the fact that how we choose to speak of God's work in the world directly impacts the systems that either help us reach or keep us from reaching toward the world that God dreams for all of us. As the story goes, Abraham and God had already had some pretty significant conversations. You'll recall that upon God's direction, Abraham had packed up his family and his possessions and headed out to settle into a new land, the land that God would show him. As Abraham looked at the vast night sky, he heard God promise that he would be the father of a nation, a patriarch to end all patriarchs, the best patriarch, the ultimate success as a man. Which is super exciting, but also kind of hard to believe when you're nearing 100 years old and your wife is not that far behind you, and when there has never been a baby in your house. It was a grief that Abraham and Sarah carried constantly, a doubt that God's promise would ever come true for them. Well, they packed up and left and were on their way, and one day, the whole camp was resting in the heat of the day. The sun was high in the sky, and it was too hot to work. Abraham was sitting under a little copse of trees near the campsite when he saw 3 men approaching from far away. Now, we don't understand fully the cultural expectations of a situation like this, but suffice it to say, this would have been unusual. Travelers, 3 of them, approaching a campground in the heat of the day, they surely were coming with very important news. And so following the expectations of hospitality and just basic survival, Abraham greeted them and insisted that they sit in the shade and rest. And he told some servants to wash the men's feet and prepare a feast for the evening. And then he ran, the text says, he ran into the tent to tell Sarah to make them a snack. If you read the text carefully, it sounds quite funny. Not only does Abraham instruct Sarah to make some food for the men, he gives her the recipe and the technique. Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes. Can you just imagine that exchange? Okay, Abraham, I'll get right on that, and thanks for the tips. Abraham's clearly nervous about the arrival of these guests. So when all the feet are washed and all the food is prepared and everyone is comfortable, the men settle down to get down to business. And the first thing that the men say to Abraham, the first thing is a question. Where is your wife Sarah? Abraham was confused. You want to talk about Sarah? You traveled all this way to talk about a woman? The travelers sitting under the trees that day were bringing up this very painful subject, opening this decades-old wound. God had promised Abraham would be the father of a great nation, but Sarah had never had a child, and she never would. This life circumstance of childlessness defined her. If you flip back in the book of Genesis to chapter 11, in fact, the very first time you and I meet Sarah, the text says, by way of introduction, Sarah was barren. She had no children. And this was an identity that weighed heavy on her as she tended the campsite and prepared the meals and worked to support Abraham as he followed God's invitation to a place unknown. It was like a huge elephant in the middle of the camp that drove a wedge between Sarah and Abraham, and worse, made both of them doubt God's plan and God's goodness. So that afternoon, as the conversation began under the trees on the edge of the camp, Sarah's ears perked up as she caught the sound of her name on the wind. Moving toward the flap in the tent, she leaned out as far as she could without raising too much of attention, cupped her hand to her ear, and listened. The men were talking about her. They were saying to Abraham that they would return in 1 year, and when they returned, Sarah would have given birth to a son. And when Sarah heard a bunch of men sitting around predicting childbirth for her in her 90s, she laughed. Sarah was struggling to get her mind and her heart around a reality of God that all of us struggle with, to learn over and over again that there is nothing too wonderful for the Lord, that God is always creating and recreating, bringing life and hope where we only see death, hopelessness, and desolation. The way we hear the story told, though, is not a lesson in our shared humanity or our corporate struggle with doubt. Instead, we learn that Sarah was wrong to laugh, that she was weak, that she was unable or unwilling to consider that God could and would work through the circumstances of her life. She might even have been bad for not accepting the stranger's announcement at face value. But rather than being invited into the miracle that was unfolding all around and within her, she was dismissed, as those without privilege and power and voice often are in our society. And when the sound of her laughter rang through the campsite, her objections were named: unfaithful, disrespectful, wrong. When the conversation of the men was interrupted by her laughter, you know they looked at each other and said, "You know how it is when these women, they get hysterical." Can you just try to imagine that? It's so hard to imagine a group of powerful men discussing the reproductive life of a woman who is not there to speak on her own behalf, making plans for her body and dictating when she would or wouldn't have a child. It seems quite appropriate to me that Sarah would respond with hysterical laughter. But then again, I'm a woman. See what I mean? This story is completely different depending on the perspective from which you tell it. The perspective from which you tell a story can change everything. How do you hear your story? What is the role that you have been assigned? Accountant? Youngest child? Immigrant? African American? Working class? Educated? Woman? Does the story you hear and tell about your life determine for you that you are an underachiever? Or unworthy, or not good enough, or unclean, or a failure, or insignificant? It's so easy for us to take on names like these, even in our subconscious, because we hear over and over messages that we are not good enough, because we see what seems to be evidence of failure all around us. Because the details of our lives don't always mirror the expectations of success that our society places upon us. And because other people tell our stories. And these stories, if they're told long enough and loud enough, they evolve into societal structures that oppress and harm and do not reflect God's hopes and intentions for our world. My friends, this is sinful. We are complicit. We have to change the way that the story is told. What would happen if we began to tell the stories of our faith from the perspectives of those who do not have privilege? What if instead of Sarah derided for laughing hysterically, this story becomes one of a voiceless, powerless woman stepping up with joy to her critical role in the work of God in the world? What would that be like? Well, it would be transformational. It would be groundbreaking, and it would be world-shifting. It would be gospel. It would be good news. There are so many in our society who hide behind the tent flaps in fear, who are not invited to sit around the campfire and talk strategy and politics and power, who hear over and over and over and even start to believe that their lives have no value. If we begin to tell the story of faith from the perspectives of people without the privilege, to amplify their voices, just imagine what might change. Instead of public Twitter rants about a witch hunt, we would hear, an inquiry has been opened into illegal abuse of power and the violation of constitutional law. Instead of, California Senator Kamala Harris makes a white man nervous with her persistent questioning and earns herself the label hysterical. We would hear important questions were raised by a powerful political leader in a congressional investigation. Instead of police officer acquitted for defending himself by shooting a man he thought was threatening, we would hear, in a gross violation of justice, Philando Castile's murderer was acquitted, continuing a pervasive pattern of police violence against Black and brown women, people in America. How will we tell the stories of our faith? How will we tell the stories of our lives? We have to begin to tell them in ways that let the voices of those who have no power begin to ring out, to tell us the truth about our own inability and unwillingness to confront injustice, to call us again and again to remember that any story that does not celebrate the identity of every person as a beloved, precious child of God, that story is being told the wrong way. As we begin this long summer of telling stories of our faith, stories that were written to remind us of God's constant faithfulness and persistent recreation in our lives, let us be very mindful of the perspectives from which the stories are told. Because it seems as people of faith, the very least we can do is to give voice to the voiceless and to tell the story of God's grace and love and healing again and again by amplifying the voices that have been silent or hysterical for far too long. Amen.